It's kind of an old expression, oh, he's just a dumb farmer. You know, they say about farmers.
Yeah.
That maybe they're farming and they're dumb. There are no dumb farmers. If they're farmers, they have to be intelligent.
Right.
That would always get through to me if I heard that expression, he's just a dumb farmer. We had a beautiful farm, 20, 25 cows.
Well, 1930 is when they left here, and the reason they left, they had purebred Holsteins, some of the best in the state of Wisconsin, and down on the lower flat down there, every year it floods and comes up, and there was a sweet clover field there, and cows ate that sweet clover, and all of them died. They were bloated, and they lost their whole herd in 1 week's time there. And so put them in pretty bad financial shape, and they decided the best thing is move, and they went to Chippewa Falls area and built up there. But I just say I remember my mother living here and telling how she walked. She taught school over at the West Church over there and walked from here across the field. But in her sleep, even years later, she'd wake up dreaming about those bulls that you were out in the field, afraid to chasing her around. As I just always remember her telling about that.
Well, I heard the story a little bit different. In the 20s, he did lose his cows through disease and other functions. The bank came to help him out by giving him a loan, and about 2 months later, the bank foreclosed. And the sheriff came around and told my grandfather that if you let the bank get everything, you're going to leave with nothing, so I suggest you have an auction. So he had an auction. He got enough money, I guess, to buy some land up near Gilman, and they moved up there. But
well, we just had a lot of fun. And of course, we thought the farmhouse was so big. And when we went back in 2000, the last year, it just seemed so small. We wondered how hired men plus this big family of my dad's all lived there all those years. But my grandpa Elmer always had to be kind of the first. He was the first to get a Model A, the first to get electricity, the first to get plumbing, and he just loved new things, trying out new things.
And new treasure is I have a letter from that my grandmother wrote. When they moved up north, they lost their farm in 1931 to the bank. They couldn't, during the Depression. And she and my grandfather went up north in the train, and they took what they could with them. And when they got up there, they had to cut down the woods. It was all just forest. And the two of them, well, my grandfather and then his son Rule, who is still living now at age 94, I think, and they cut down all that and built the house, and so I was able to visit that. That was one of my fondest memories, was visiting them once every summer. And during World War II, we had to take the train. We couldn't drive because of the gas rationing. And my grandmother would make wonderful molasses cookies for me, but at that time I didn't appreciate it. Now it's one of my favorites, but I used to take a bite out of it and then I'd hide it underneath the porch. And I just felt so bad thinking about that, so guilty.
There was a little problem when they brought the house across the river. They felt the river was full, solid enough to support it. And they got about halfway across the river and they heard a cracking sound, which meant that the ice was cracking. And actually the back end of the house was starting to sink because the ice itself was sinking down into the water. And there were a number of people there, of course, helping with this project, and there was all of a sudden, stop, stop, stop. And my dad says, no way. He said, go fast, go fast. And they got it off the ice and onto shore. And after all that excitement, they let it sit there until the next morning. And then they came back and moved it the rest of the way to the location where the house is still there today.
When?
Dad sold the farm in 1973 when he saw that his children were all going to go off to college and do something else.
Okay. Yeah, and my dad was a farmer, very good farmer, and we had Holstein cattle, and I could go in and milk 4 cows at night and come in, and the sisters would still be doing dishes. So I was happy to help milk cows at night.
Your excuse.
Yeah, well, what else? We were in church every Sunday, unless a big storm came up, in Sunday school from little and on, and very thankful for that. My dad sang in the choir for a while. He stuttered, and I inherited stammering. If you don't think that was embarrassing in school, you'd hold your breath and suddenly the word would come out. But I finally got over it. As you can see, I talk too much now.
That's true.
Yeah, that's true, she says. Oh, what else can I say? I love being on the farm because we lived right near the Manitowoc River, and we'd even go down there, and the muddy is real muddy, and the shoreline, we'd walk through the mud, and then towards the middle it would be nice and clear. So I think we had a good life on the farm. My mother was a wonderful cook. My dad was a wonderful farmer, and I helped milk cows, took calves to the county fair 4-H club, usually got a championship or a first or high grade on our calves. She didn't take any. I think she was just
I did too.
Did you take one?
And I won 3rd prize.
Well, you did one time? Oh, well, I did lots of years. And we had a good life on the farm. We worked, helped with different chores, and had a big house, 4 bedrooms up, and oh, how I hated to clean all those bedrooms. They were big, but we had a good time as a family. You want to add? I talked enough.
I mean, after my dad became a pastor, of course, we could never come over at Christmas. But we came every summer, and my dad, then being the only boy, since his 3 brothers had died, would help. He would take his vacation in the summer and come up for 2 or 3 weeks, 3 weeks I think, and help his dad harvest, thresh. And so we were always here, and so we kids got kind of bored. And so we would go over and play with, say, John and David and Paul. Miriam was too little. Yeah, but we would play with those kids and look for kids around the area to play with. And I was always envious because my older brother Merv would come over sometimes for probably 4 or 5 summers, the entire summer, and would spend over here. And he was the oldest and a boy, so he got to ride the tractors, drive the machinery, and things he really now, shouldn't have done. But they needed him actually, and my dad wasn't free all summer, so he and my grandfather were doing all this. And then,
how old was your older brother then?
How old was he?
Yeah.
From say 9 or 10 to 15, 16. He was 16 when my grandfather died, and I was 13. And so I begged one summer to come over and spend a few weeks. Well, the times were kind of sexist, and I was stuck in the house ironing pillowcases and helping make food for the threshers. It just wasn't my idea of what a farm should be like. One time my grandmother caught me. My grandfather had allowed me to ride the baler up into the barn loft. Very dangerous with all those gears and the machinery. My grandmother, she didn't swear, but the language was just, she was ripping my grandfather apart. How dare you? Well, so we would come to the farm and we were just mesmerized. We were always out there for the milkings, and my grandfather always had this fun little thing. We thought it was real, where he'd pretend to eat flies off the barn, the window ledges. And so we would do it because, yeah, we thought he was really doing it. And
George's family was on the original, in the original
Yeah.
Helly Thompson,
Right.
or I mean Thomas Helly.
And they were on the, sort of on the hill.
Your farm then, your Elmer and Aletta's farm, and your farm was a new house.
We had a new house, yeah.
Okay, on adjoining farms.
Yeah, so my mother moved into a brand new house when
Okay.
and another thing about Mom is that her father owned a farm that had strawberries on it, lots of strawberries, and they had to have pickers. And so my mother was the main picker. She was the best picker. So when she was married, it was strawberry time, June 14th. And she had a conscience that bothered her a lot. She couldn't leave her parents with all that work, strawberry work. So she stayed overnight that first night, I think that first week, all strawberries, before she got to live with her husband on the farm. So we always thought that was...
That's dedication.
Yeah, dedication. And they always had a big harvest, so of course that was what she did.
Grandpa would milk the cows every morning around 5:30 or 6, and then in the evening about 5:30 or 6. And he would also often put them down in fields that were separated from the barn area. So we'd walk them down the road and put them in this field, and then we'd have to go get them in the morning at 5 o'clock in the morning and bring them back. And I would go out and I'd call them, "Come boss, come boss, come boss," and the cows would just look at me and blink. And then Grandpa would come and he'd call them, and of course then they'd come. And so they'd come up and we'd have this milking, and the cats would come and wait for scraps of milk to be given to them. There were all kinds of barn cats. I always tried to catch the barn cats, and I paid a price for it because I got scratched very a great deal by those cats. They weren't very friendly.
You were your dad's hired man,
Yeah.
or your mother's hired girl?
No, I was more my dad's hired man. Drove horses and did a lot of outside work. I helped in the house too, but not as much as I did outside.
Another thing that happened was that Uncle George's daughter, I think her name was Clarine, and her husband Bill were responsible for the bean picking that took place at the canning plant in Valders. And so I was asked if I'd like to go and pick beans, and so sure, and you could earn some money doing this. And so I was there early in the morning with a whole bunch of kids. I think that Bill and Clarine had 4 of them themselves, and they would give us these 2 sacks. And one was for the yellow beans and one was for the green beans. I think the yellow beans were bigger, so we got a cent and a half for picking the bigger beans, and we got 3 cents a pound for the smaller beans. And I'll bet I picked 3 or 4 hours. It was hard work. You're bending over and you're picking all these beans, and you got to make sure that they're not rotten. And at the end of the day, I think I made $1.20, or I don't know. It was not a lot of money for all day work, but I did that at least twice. I joined the group for picking beans.
If Harvey's talking about the same one that I'm thinking of, it wasn't hay, it was pea vines. And that's the reason I was on the load alone, because the 2 men were throwing them up by hand with forks. Because pea vines you just rolled, you couldn't bring them up on the hay lift thing because they were too slippery. So they were loading the wagon and I was driving the team. And like he said, the one horse kind of bucked the other and the bridle came off and away they went. And the fence was coming up fast. It was probably about out where that telephone pole is. And my dad yelled, "Pull the brakes." And we were fortunate enough that we had a wagon that had brakes. Most wagons didn't. But my dad was very ingenious at inventing things, and he had rigged up a wagon that was on rubber wheels with brakes. So I pulled the brakes and the back tires started to drag and the horses went slower and slower, and we stopped just at the fence.
Nobody hurt.
Nobody hurt. But I never dropped the reins. I hung right on.
Did you help with chores and so forth outside?
I helped with everything outside. I was like my dad's little hired man. I did everything with him. I was only about 7, maybe 6, 7 years old when he taught me to drive the car. Made a little seat for me so it boosted me up, put some wooden extensions on the brake and the clutch, because in those days you had a clutch too, you know, so that I could reach them, and I would drive the car from fence post to fence post as he was fencing. And he'd stay on the trailer in the back. He never had a truck. And so I was really little when I started doing all the things he needed a hired man for. Milk cows, cut hay, rake hay, cut corn, shock grain, whatever there was to do, us girls were out there.
Did all of you help outside?
Judy did later on. She was 8 years younger than me, you know. Dorothy didn't do as much outdoors, no, but Dorothy was good in the house. She helped Mother with the work. Mother was a gardener. She loved her gardens, flowers and vegetables, and so she'd be out working in that, and Dorothy would be doing the housework. We always teased her. We said she can't go in the barn and milk cows because her fingernails are too long. And it was true. Couldn't milk her.
That didn't interfere with housework.
No, not well. Didn't have to worry about the cows in the house.
Yeah.
You know.
One of the high points for me is every summer I was there, I must have spent 4 or 5 summers there, at least a month with the grandparents, is that Jerome Newmeyer would drove the milk truck, and I got to ride with him once during the time I was there. And so he'd come in and he'd pick up the milk, and I'd jump in the truck and we'd go pick up milk from other farmers, and then we go into Kiel, which is, I don't know, 20, 30 miles away, and he would unload all of the milk cans and pick up empties from the day before, and then he would do shopping for the farmers. He'd pick up cheese or butter, supplies that they'd ordered, and then when we came home, he would stop along at several of the farms and deliver these supplies or the empty cans that he had as well. And I don't know why it was such an intriguing thing for me, but I loved going with Jerome on that, and he was such a gracious man to do that. The Newmeyer family lived down the road, and he lived about halfway down the road, is not too far from Uncle George's place, and I still remember where that was.
Because I picked stones all over here. I had all the field work I wanted.
We're still picking stones.
You never get done.
Every spring.
You never get done with them because they just keep coming up.
And
I was saying before that every Saturday morning I sat on the porch there with a 2-gallon jar between my knees, and I was making butter.
Making butter, churning butter. How fabulous.
Had to patch his own overalls after nobody else was there to do it. With the old,
He was a handyman.
he was handy at everything.
Our kids called him Grandpa Fix-It.
Yeah. Yeah, he could fix anything. And he would take all the time in the world to fix
And
something.
describe his hands.
His hands? Oh my gosh. He had the biggest hands I have ever seen. Well, and maybe not the biggest, but the thickest fingers, and he would use those thick fingers to pick up those little pieces and put things together that you wouldn't believe could ever get put back together. And with his loading shells too, he could do that real well with his big hands.
And repair furniture. People
Yeah.
would bring, after your mother was gone. He didn't charge anything, except that they would invite him to bring it back, or they would invite him to come and pick it up. So he'd make arrangements to go about mealtime to
Yeah,
pick up whatever it was to be repaired.
right.
And then he'd make arrangements to take it back about mealtime. And not charge enough to cover his time.
Oh
at
no.
all.
Because he did everything, well, like you'd say, the old-fashioned way, carving, and if the furniture had a little piece missing, he would carve a little piece to fit and glue it in and sand it off, and you wouldn't even see it, you know.
The mittens that we have, or you use them as a liner for leather mittens.
Oh, the big wool mittens. Well, that Aunt Clarina knit those, but her husband, Dan Kimball, raised the sheep, and he sheared the sheep, and Aunt Clarina made yarn out of
Spun the yarn.
spun the yarn, and then she knit the mittens, and I've got them yet.
I remember one summer I came here, and my grandpa showed me all of this manure that was on the ground. And there was a manure spreader right next to it, but for some reason, all that manure was on the ground, and I think he told me that something was broken or whatever. I don't know how it ended up there and not in the manure spreader, because right up here was a conveyor belt, right, Jim? Conveyor belt that would take the manure down. It would go right in the manure spreader, and they could take it out to the fields. Well, for some reason, it didn't get in that manure spreader. So I said to my grandpa, I said, well, I'll load it in there. I'll get it in there. Well, I was, again, 8, 9 years old, and I thought this was a great thing I could do for my grandpa. So I shoveled and shoveled and shoveled. I don't know how long it took me, but I cleared out that whole pile. And when my grandpa came and saw it, he said, Mark, he said, you've really helped me. And that made me feel just like $1 million.
Grandpa had an idea for me when I came to that, how I could earn some money. He said, we have cows that give birth to calves and down in the woods, and they hide them. And he said, I don't have time to go looking for them. So if you'll go looking for the baby calf and you find it, I'll give you $1. So this happened several times during the summer, that a cow would disappear who was expecting, and Grandpa would say, well, you better go find the calf. So I would head down to the woods, and I would go through these, and the woods were quite thick. It was next to the Manitowoc River. And so I'd go through there, and sometimes it was buggy, but I'd look for Mama Cow, of course, standing. She had hidden the calf very well, and so I'd finally found Mama Cow, and then I'd go running up to the house or the barn, and I'd find Grandpa, and he'd take his pickup truck, and he'd drive it down to the woods, and he'd walk in with me and pick up the calf and put it in the back of the pickup truck, and then Mama Cow would follow the truck slowly as we went back to the barn, and he'd put the calf in the calf pen. So that was one of my favorite things of earning money, was to find the newborn calves.
The bus. My brother was 5 years older than I was, and we always took our milk to the condensery in Valders. So we had an old 32 Chev that my dad cut the back off and made a pickup truck out of it. He was a pasture car, he made a pickup. So he'd haul milk into the condensery in the morning, and then we'd park down by Crystal's store and walk up to the school. And after school, we'd go back down and make a U-turn and come back, because he wasn't old enough to drive that either. So then, when he got out of high school, I was just going into high school, and I didn't have a license then either, so I did the same thing. But by that time, we had a 41 International pickup truck. And when finally I got to be 14 years old, and I applied for a permit for farm work only, and I went to Lloyd Erickson, who was the marshal in Valders at that time, and I took my written test, and I passed it, and Mr. Erickson said, good to go. Ron says, I'll send this in, you'll have your permit within about 5 or 6 days. And I said, well, Mr. Erickson, you have to take a ride with me. And he said, Ron, I've been watching you drive for 2 years. He says, I don't have to go for a ride with you. But that's how things worked back in those days. You know, you can't do that now.
But you were a farm boy.
Yeah, yeah. So that's how it worked. And I continued to drive and haul the milk.
Well, can I ask one more question? What was the best part about growing up on a farm for you?
Having a little sister.
Having what? Having what?
Having a little sister.
Oh, really?
That they tease to death, yes.
You better repeat the first part of that. I don't know if I got it. No, that's okay. It's all right.
Oh,
okay. So what's the best part for you of growing up on a farm?
Well, I guess we were taught how to work.
One day I was near the chicken coop, and a rooster went after me and scared the living daylights out of me. And Grandpa was upset with that, and I remember that evening we had roasted chicken. So that poor rooster paid for his indiscretions with his life. But Grandma would always go and pick up the eggs under the chickens, and I would try to do that once in a while, but you put your hand underneath the hen, very often you get pecked, and I didn't like that very well, so Grandma usually did the picking up of the eggs.
What was the happiest moment growing up on the farm?
Boy, I suppose we kids, I don't know if you did, we took calves to the county fair, Manitowoc County Fair, and I got a championship prize one year. Was I happy. You know, you had to show your calf, and it had to stand just so, with the 4 feet just so, and
And okay, so it was a calf you were showing?
yeah. I think first prize was $8 way back then. Did you take calves to the county fair?
Sure I did. And I also was a Dairy Queen. I forgot to mention that.
Oh yeah, she's a Dairy Queen.
Dairy Queen.
We had fond memories of Grandpa picking us up when we lived in Manitowoc already, and Grandma was deceased, and he would pick us up and go to the county fair. And none of the other grandchildren wanted to go because they had to spend so much time in the horse barns. And I'd swear that he could have worked at the county fair judging the horses.
Yeah.
He knew his horses.
He pointed out all the good parts and cows. We had to go to the cow barns too.
Well, even the chicken, the pigs.
Yeah.
We had to see all the animals, but especially his love was horses.
Yeah. And then we had breakfast, and then he took us on the tilt-a-whirls. That was every year. It was always
Ice cream, don't forget the ice cream.
It's a good thing. But the Torrison family, and well, like John Thompson is here now today, and he had a horse, and I had a horse, so we'd go riding together. And then when I was dating Connie, if we want to go riding together, I would borrow John's horse, and so that Connie and I could ride together. But back in those days, the whole neighborhood were friends or relatives, or friends and or relatives. It was a close-knit group, and we had a lot of fun together doing that.
I remember Grandma had this real nice flour bin, and of course they didn't buy flour like we do nowadays, 5 and 10 pound bags. They bought 100 pound in the cloth sack, and that bin just tipped out, and then you pushed it back in, and I always was amazed at how cool that was, but we never bought flour like that, so. Yeah.
In their kitchen, they had a big oak table with that cloth foot in the middle, and I can remember thinking, what a beautiful table it was. And I think when they sold the farm, you know, that was when people went into a dining room, these little dinette tables, and I heard by the grapevine that that table was just taken to the dump, and I mean, I don't know if it's true or not, but then you wonder, it's too bad somebody couldn't have had saved that one thing from their home.
Overly proud, I think, of our ancestors, and we just feel that we were born into a very, wonderful family. That doesn't mean that there are other stories to tell, and you've heard some of those. And but I remember my dad being very forceful. He said he grew up where children were raised in a certain way, and that was going to stop with him. That none of that would carry over in the way he treated his children. And it never was carried over. And it's just a beautiful thing when you think about it, because not everybody was that fortunate. And then my mother was just raised in pure love, and so then you have a happy family.
When the day or two before she died, she was knitting a pair of mittens for me. And she got those finished, and I went to the barn and was playing with the cats, I suppose, and took my mittens off and laid them down. And a calf got one and chewed the thing up. Well, Grandma said, I was all upset, a little kid. And Grandma said, well, I'll just replace it. I'll get a new one for you. But then she had that stroke, and she never finished it. And for years, we had a trunk upstairs that had a bunch of, well, I called it junk, but things that Mom or Dad wanted to save, and they were thrown in that trunk. And that one lone mitten stayed in that trunk for years.
My favorite event at the farm was threshing season. Each year, until the last year I was there, a whole crew would come in. We'd start at Uncle George's and then would come to Grandpa's farm, and I would drive tractor all day long. Here I am, 9 years old or whatever it is, and I'm driving tractor, and I thought this was the cat's meow. So I would drive the tractor down the field with a wagon behind it, and these men would be there, and they'd pick up the grain and throw it in the wagon until the wagon was full, and then I'd haul it up to the barn, and I'd jump off the tractor, and Grandpa would take it from there, and then I'd get on the next tractor and the wagon and head back down the field, and this went on all day long. So I was out in the bright sunshine all day long. I think I must have gotten really brown. The sun was hot many of those days, and I was driving tractor. But what I remember the most were the meals. The Bible talks about heaven might be like a great banquet. Well, this was about as close to heaven as I can imagine. We had enormous meals at threshing time. I remember Brigitta and Elmira and Eva Jean came home to help out their mother. It was such a big deal, and other women were there from neighboring farms, and we had every kind of meat you can imagine. We had potatoes, we had breads of all kinds, we had every dessert you could imagine, from pies to cakes to cookies. I mean, it was a feast, and we'd eat like kings, and then go back out, and there was always a lot left over in the evening too that we could eat. So I loved threshing season, and and Grandma also had a big garden, so she'd have every fruit and vegetable you could imagine as well. We even went up to Sturgeon Bay one time, picked cherries, and brought those back. And so threshing season. On a plaintive note, I remember the last year I went up there. Grandpa was not healthy at that time, but what he had was a combine. He must have rented a combine, and no more threshing. And he asked me to jump up and ride around the field with him. So I rode around the field with him once on the combine, and then I said I'd like to get off. So I jumped off the combine, and as I was walking back to the house, I thought, I'm not needed here anymore. Something has changed here. And it just seemed like my days at the farm were over. Sad time.